In this video, we are talking about the sources of competitive advantage. I showed you this slide in last week's video when we were talking about industry level effects. We used Michael Porter's 5 forces as a way to analyze why different industries are profitable or more profitable than one another. So why are utilities less profitable than semiconductors? And take this chart with a grain of salt because there's a lot of disagreement about the exact percentages here in this pie chart, but let's take an approximation here and say those industry effects are worth about 20% of the story. Today we're talking about this much bigger slice of the pie, which are those firm level effects. And these are things that we might be particularly interested in as future strategists because these are the kind of organization level variables that as managers and strategists, we might actually have some control over. So to give you an example of variation within an industry, because I already brought up semiconductors, let's talk about that one. The average profit margin in the semiconductor industry for this time period here was about 13%. But obviously that really doesn't tell you a lot about the spread within the industry. At the top of the chart, you see Broadcom, which had a 40% profit margin. At the bottom of the chart, you have Micron Technology, which has over a negative 40% profit margin. So why is Micron losing money while Broadcom's making money? What really accounts for those differences? So Parag Jimawat came along and he said, it's a really simple answer: value. Companies have to create value for customers. And in order to do that, they have to control their costs. So competitive advantage, by Jimawat's definition, is just the spread between the cost a firm incurs to produce a good or service and the willingness to pay of a customer. So let's illustrate how you increase competitive advantage in a very, very simple way. So assume you make widgets and you can charge customers $100 for a widget. It costs you $50 to produce a widget. The value you create is this wedge between the customer willingness to pay and the cost to produce that widget. So that's $50, this blue box here. Now say you make a better widget. It doesn't cost you any more to produce them, but now you produce them in different colors or with different features. This is an extreme example because likely if you're adding some features, it might cost a little more to produce, but assume right now that it doesn't cost you any more to produce. And customers are willing to pay $120 now. So you've increased that maximum willingness to pay by $20, and we consider this a differentiation strategy. On the other hand, you can also create another $20 of competitive advantage, or that wedge between willingness to pay and the cost to produce, through a low-cost strategy. This doesn't mean you're the lowest cost provider of a good or service, but it just means you have some comparative advantage in something you do in a way that lowers your costs. So if you could lower your cost to produce from $50 to $30 and keep your price at $100, then you've still created an additional $20 of competitive advantage. So you can see those two green boxes about the same size. So like I said before, cost leadership doesn't just mean lowest cost, and differentiation isn't just different, but different in a way that creates value for consumers. So my extreme example didn't show this company incurring any additional cost to create additional choices or options or improve this widget in any way, shape, or form. Likely there would be some increase in cost, but as long as the increase in value added or willingness to pay is larger than the increase in cost, then it's more attractive. So what Jimawat makes a distinction between creating competitive advantage versus sustaining it. And in his mind, a competitive advantage is sustainable if it's also difficult to imitate. So it's not enough just to be efficient at what you do or excellent at what you do. You also need to do it in a way where your competitors cannot readily copy what you do. So this kind of reinforces the same point that Porter was making about doing things in a unique way. So when Jim Watt talks about how do you figure out what your source of competitive advantage is, he introduces the value chain model. And this is a useful way to think about the activities that a firm undertakes. So you can change these labels slightly to make more sense if you're talking about a service-based or knowledge-based company, because inbound logistics operations, outbound logistics might sound a little bit more like manufacturing or goods and heavy, like tangible goods and services, but it's a very similar kind of set of activities and a flow that simply tells you the supporting activities up here don't directly produce the good or service. These are kind of the overhead activities. These light blue ones are the ones that get from raw material to the end user. And you can look at every single set of activities at every step of the process to think about which lends itself to increasing that wedge through either differentiation or reducing costs. This also, of course, has a lot to do with understanding your customers. So if you're segmenting or targeting a very select segment of the market, you should know your customers well and understand what drives their particular willingness to pay. Another way of looking at this, instead of thinking about firms in terms of activities, is to think in terms of resources and capabilities. And that's the idea that was introduced by Collis and Ruckstad in this week's reading. So Collis introduces and Ruckstad introduced this idea of the resource-based view of the firm. So instead of talking about activities, they talk about resources and capabilities as the basis of competitive advantage. So they think of firms as basically a collection of different resources. So those are like the physical or intangible assets that add value. And capabilities are your abilities to exploit those physical aspects in order to create value. So do you have the skills and ability to actually make use of a valuable asset? So you can think about you can use this model, the VRIO model, to understand if a resource or capability would lead to a sustainable competitive advantage. So whether you want to base your analysis on activities or resources or capabilities, you'll find that while these terminologies are different and the analysis is a little bit different, they end up oftentimes in the same place. So to me, it's the difference between thinking about a firm as a bunch of verbs or a bunch of nouns. But either way, you need both to make a complete sentence. So the VRIO model, though, is a good one to consider using when you think about what makes a firm special. So you don't use it for the entire firm. You have to think about a specific resource or capability, and you have to ask, does it add value? Is it rare? Is it easy to imitate? And then finally, is the organization itself able to actually capture value from the use of that resource? So these are good models to apply as you consider those firm level effects.